Welcome back everybody to the final part of our journey on creating ATP. So hopefully we haven't lost anybody yet. The final part deals with, and we'll keep this very short and sweet, deals with what happens when you do not have enough oxygen available to your cells that you cannot possibly use aerobic cellular respiration. How do you actually create enough ATP still to survive those conditions? So thankfully there's another process known as anaerobic cellular respiration. So cellular respiration that does not require oxygen. So this is going to occur when there's no oxygen available. And there's two different types of anaerobic cellular respiration. You have alcoholic anaerobic cellular respiration, where you're producing alcohol, and then other organisms like us use a process known as lactic acid anaerobic cellular respiration, where we produce lactic acid in our muscle cells. Anaerobic cellular respiration you are very familiar with because it's also called fermentation. And you can see in the picture that there's many foods that you eat that are produced through fermentation because humans like the taste. We force these little molecules, we force these bacteria to undergo anaerobic cellular respiration to change the flavor of our food. They're doing it because they need ATP. We force them to do it because we like the taste of what they're actually creating. So you have beer, you have root beer, you have some blue cheeses, you have pickles especially, cider, wine, bread, sourdough bread. So there's many foods that you consume that are produced through fermentation, where it's a necessary process for the bacteria to survive because they don't have enough oxygen available to them. But basically we force them to do anaerobic cellular respiration. We force them to produce other flavors because we enjoy that taste. One of the drawbacks of anaerobic cellular respiration and why we use aerobic when we can is that much less ATP is actually produced. So anaerobic cellular respiration is fine for a little yeast cell or a single bacteria cell, but we cannot possibly survive on anaerobic cellular respiration alone because we're just too large. Our needs are too much that we could not survive on the small amount of ATP produced. We can do it in small time quantities. So when you're running, your muscle cells need a ton of ATP because you're running. So they can use anaerobic cellular respiration to keep them alive and keep you running. However, that's why eventually you huff and puff and have to replenish that ATP supply that you burn through. So the first type is known as alcoholic fermentation. And some examples that use alcoholic fermentation are yeast. So yeast that we use to rise our bread, they're fungi, they're single-celled fungus. And some other bacteria use alcoholic fermentation. And the main difference, as I said, between the two types of fermentation is basically what is actually being produced. So in alcoholic fermentation, you're producing alcohol and CO2 as waste. So CO2 is produced no matter what in any type of cellular respiration. And the main thing for alcoholic is you're producing alcohol. So you can see the process of alcoholic fermentation is glycolysis still happens, because remember that process is anaerobic. That process of breaking that glucose molecule into two pyruvate molecules is still occurring because that step did not require oxygen. So you're still using glycolysis, and that's producing CO2, alcohol, and a measly 2 ATP. So remember the full process of aerobic cellular respiration with the Krebs cycle and the the electron transport chain created 36 ATP. This is making a measly 2, which is fine if you're a little bacterial cell, not okay if you're a multicellular human or plant. The second type of fermentation is lactic acid fermentation. This is the type that you do. You do not do alcoholic fermentation, you do lactic acid fermentation. So your muscle cells specifically, when you cannot breathe in enough oxygen because physically you just can't get enough air into your lungs, that compared to how much ATP is being used when you're running, your cells have to switch over to lactic acid fermentation to still make enough ATP to survive until you stop running and you're able to huff and puff and get enough oxygen and replenish that supply. So you use lactic acid fermentation where, once again, glycolysis is happening, and the only difference between the two types of fermentation is we produce lactic acid while alcoholic fermentation produces alcohol. And you can see that's also how you produce some of yogurt and cottage cheese, how they have that acidic taste is because we force those bacteria to produce lactic acid. We force them to do lactic acid fermentation, so we get that sour taste in the food that we enjoy to eat. And once again, you're making a whole measly 2 ATP. This nice little diagram will help summarize all of cellular respiration. So you see, no matter what, you start out with a glucose molecule. That glucose molecule is moved into the cytoplasm, where no matter what, glycolysis happens. If there is no oxygen available, the products of glycolysis move on to anaerobic cellular respiration, which depending on the organism could be alcoholic or it could be lactic acid, and you produce this 2-measly ATP only. If there is oxygen available, then the products of glycolysis move to the mitochondria, where the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain happen, and a massive amount of 36 ATP are produced for every one glucose molecule. So you do need to understand these two pathways. If there's no oxygen, it's an anaerobic pathway, produces 2 ATP. If there is oxygen available, it's an aerobic pathway, and it produces 36 ATP.